you know? Find the ways and means to maintain that connection, right, with that.
And find a seat. I'd appreciate it. Just wanted to give you guys a real quick introduction about what we're doing here over the next 2 weeks at Transfer Food Hall. We have planned, starting back in December, a 2-week workshop for participants from across the Southeast to come in and study the city, learn about the city, and uncover things that could be better here, and do projects to kind of address those issues. I'm going to keep this short because many of you have been here on previous nights, but I at least wanted to introduce the 17 students we have here for the next 2 weeks who are from 6 different states and 8 different schools. So if you guys could stand up in the front row. Yay. These guys deserve all the credit for this whole thing happening in the first place. It was a risk for them to apply. In the first place, it was a selective application process, a little bit of an act of faith to follow through on all of that because at the time of the application, no one was sure what was going on with COVID and whether or not this would even happen. Although with the governor's announcements today, I think we're not sure what's going on with COVID again. And they followed through and came here. They've paid tuition to be here, taken 2 weeks out of their lives. They're staying in a city that's, for most of them, not familiar to them, and hopefully learning a lot. The lecture series started as a curriculum for the students and has kind of taken on a life of its own as we've made it public and invited people to come hear the talks. Tonight is our first true lecture. The first 3 events we had were the first one was more of an event or a party thrown by Nick Neptune, who's over here in the Tar Heels wind jacket. It's a great evening. And then the second and third events were both panel discussions, one of local thought leaders and another of architects who practice in the area. Tonight is our first more formal lecture, or a true lecture, and I'm really excited to welcome a good friend of mine, Jonathan Tate from New Orleans, who does some amazing work down there. I hope most of you have taken the time to look at his work before showing up tonight. I am going to turn the mic over to Robbie Johnson. One other thing I want to say before I do that is that one of the other big reasons this is happening is because of a lot of generosity of people who've given a ton of time, in-kind donations, and also just straight-up financial sponsorships, including Robbie's firm, Raleigh Architecture Company, who most people know are our biggest competitors in town. It really is one of the best things about living and working here, I think largely because of the school and the design community that fosters. There are a lot of great firms here, more than we deserve, and instead of fighting with each other, although we do that a little bit too, we're more supportive of each other than anything else. So, Robbie, we appreciate your support, the support of your office, and I'll hand it over to you to introduce Jonathan.
Thanks, Matt. I should take a quick moment to thank everyone, Matt and Zach and all the other folks at In Situ that I've actually never had the opportunity to meet, for all the time and effort and energy and creativity and vision that it took to plan and assemble and pull this event off. So I know they're not going to ask that of themselves, so if everyone would, please give them a huge applause. This is a really incredible opportunity for us to all be together, to really consider critically about all the things that are happening in our city, and to be able to have a really public conversation about the challenges that are in front of us. I do hope that everyone has had the opportunity to participate thus far. For those of you who were not lucky enough to witness the delivery and opening ceremonies by Nick Neptune, please find those online when they're posted and bask in every second of it. It's quite impressive. As always, Nick, thanks for sharing your enthusiasm for our community and everything you do here. It does take a village, as Matt mentioned, and it's a pretty amazing group of sponsors, and we're delighted to be part of that. But tonight we are here to welcome our first out-of-town guest, Jonathan Tate. Jonathan's work spans from housing to education to transit, and their work has been decorated with recognition at the local, regional, national, and international level. A few highlights include Progressive Architecture, Academy of Arts and Letters, and various AIA national awards. I've never met Jonathan until about 10 minutes ago, and so far it has been a delight. And from the little time I've spent with him, I think I can say that that's not what he really wants you to know about who he is, his practice, and the work they create. While I can't speak for him exactly, what you need to know about their work is their dedication to providing housing and projects for the underserved, the previously incarcerated, and the marginalized communities in New Orleans and surrounding areas. His experience in New Orleans reinforces the core mission of the Real Matter Workshop. Raleigh and other exploding urban centers have a lot to learn from his work's clever subversion of regulatory requirements that offer relief from the struggles of inequity, density, and affordability. What's clear, and to quote from their website, is that regardless of particular parameters, we bring the same intensity of imagination and invention to everything we do. Each project is special to us, and we give them each special attention. You'll see through the images, the work is easy, it's undemanding, it appears effortless. They're complex problems that are solved with simple and intelligible solutions. I personally am excited to learn a lot more tonight, and I'm sure you are as well. So please welcome me in joining Jonathan Tate from his office, OJT.
Quite the introduction. Thank you. Thank you for that. Actually, I want to start by saying thanks to everyone here. It's a real delight to be in Raleigh and to be the first lecturer for the inaugural year for Real Matters. Maybe I'll get to come back if I do well tonight. Next year, make an annual thing out of this. And then likewise, I want to thank Matt and Zach for the invitation and for their efforts in getting me up here, and again for their welcoming me into the city, and into the workshop. Okay, I'm actually going to read some stuff off tonight, which I generally don't do, and I have to say I'm a little rusty at the audience thing. I'm like some of the other speakers I think already have said similar things. It's funny to be in front of people again, although it's great to be in front of people again. To actually see and interact with people instead of a screen is quite nice. But that said, I am a little rusty here, so bear with me as we go through this. Okay, so to get started for a second, given the pretense of this term, I wanted to take a minute to discuss more than I typically do who we are, where we come from, and why we do what we do. And I normally don't read off a preamble, but if you'll forgive me, I'm going to read this time. So just to keep from rambling, here I am rambling. And I'm going to give you the literal and metaphorical green screen while I do it. So you'll see plenty of images here in a minute. Okay. And this was actually nice to put all this down. Again, in the context of this gathering and considering where everybody's from, and then as a chance just to reflect on our office for a minute and how and where we started, it was nice to compose this. So to begin, I should say first, we are a small practice working generally in the regional South and specifically in New Orleans, Louisiana, where we are located. Indeed, most of what we do is in New Orleans. I'm not from there, though, and New Orleans doesn't much fit the model of most southern cities as we might know them. It, however, has more in common than a New Orleanian would like to think or admit. But for me, it is a significant and important context. I moved there in a post-Katrina environment. Short stints in 2006, 2007, then permanently in 2008. The city was still suffering heavily from the storm, but like no place I could imagine, it was alive with possibilities amid the chaos. There was drive towards renewal and invention in every conceivable sector of the city's structure, economy, the schools, planning, and more. See, my community of cohort worked together, communed together, supported one another, and had a life together invested in our passions. Wasn't always easy or fun, but it was for me impressionable and meaningful. I think of this time as perhaps the most germane of any period I've experienced through my professional career. Work had meaning for community, for yourself. And people that participated with you were just, if not often more, committed to the challenge. Work was participatory, social, entrepreneurial, and disciplinary speaking boundless. Let's see. There's a historical contradiction here that should also be pointed out. I moved to New Orleans in 2008, which was the beginning of the Great Recession. So amidst the rebuilding we were working towards in our own community over the following few years, we were also watching the total breakdown of the world's economic system and all the horrifying reverberations. We weren't immune to this. The office I was part of at the time effectively dissolved, but we were to a degree isolated from it, either through massive federal rebuilding subsidies or just being overwhelmed by what was directly in front of us. Okay, this brief summary of a time serves as the pretext or reference point of our practice and the work that I'm going to speak about tonight. In 2011, when I opened the office 10 years ago, as of next week, I set about to encapsulate and perpetuate all the experiences, relationships, and roles I was privileged to in the preceding years. This meant focusing on community, mission-driven work, being proactive and entrepreneurial, and through the platform of an office, using our agency to instigate and originate meaningful work. See, that all sounds pretty clear, at least as an aspirational agenda, but in practice it's been a bit messy. I feel it's important to note that in advance of presenting what will appear to be neatly conceived work, that a practice is itself a project. And ours has, and thankfully continues to be one. Probably our most important project. Although it has meant a lot of stops and starts, projects and clients, saying yes to things, then regretting the outcomes, and struggling to maintain focus amongst the challenges of keeping an office moving. But over 10 years, we have a few things to show for it. See, I can categorically say a few things about our work. First, our client base is comprised of a significant portion of community groups, CDCs, and NDCs. We also work with a lot of private developers, occasionally an institution or municipality. Programmatically, we do a lot of housing, as Robbie's already mentioned, single-family, multifamily, affordable, market rate, whatever. But we have an equal share of diverse use types, commercial, institutional, hospitality, et cetera. In fact, we sort of pride ourselves on the range of things that we manage to participate in. We also do numerous urban design and architectural planning projects. There's always some form of investigation in process in the office, and on occasion, we even originate our own work. So, one more page of this, and I'll leave you alone. Let's see. Overall, most of the projects are humble in scale. We tend to be more interested in the things that often get overlooked, especially by architects. Two, given our work is in a unique place, we embrace that, but we often try to remove those distinctions. We more frequently think of our work as topical and connected to more than just our own home. Okay, so with that said, I have pulled together a few projects that I'm going to walk through tonight and try to describe, and hopefully that sort of collection of work here will do a better job of explaining what we're up to than I just did here. I also realized when I put all this together that these, just to say generally, tend to be what I should refer to sort of as legacy projects in a way, like they go on and on and on and on. And I think, you know, having students in the audience, it's important to say that there's nothing, if you don't already know this, there's nothing immediate about architecture, right? Like projects take time, and these projects are all the, I say all, some were quick, but most of these have gone on for at least 5 to 6 years, and they continue to go on. So the projects that I'm going through are all active, and I'm just showing you sort of a moment in time and the kind of lineage of the project, and Bastion's one of these. And to start off, this is for a nonprofit organization in New Orleans named Bastion. It is actually was developed to create a housing community for post 9/11 war veterans with long-term disabilities associated with their service. So this is an organization that was created by a man, Dylan Tate, who himself was a service member and did a tour in Iraq and then came back to the country and was watching his friends and his own cohort sort of come back after after receiving or being injured, let's say, in a myriad of ways, and not having a place to go and work with a like community as a way to recover and heal and process. So the project itself is actually kind of interesting. We started this back in 2013 or 2014. We met Dylan. I was actually, as a professor at Tulane University, we were doing a design workshop for him as he was originally conceiving the idea. And I was actually a faculty sponsor for a program that helped host the charrette, where they had professionals in the city and from outside the city, along with potential residents of this community, to come in and sort of talk about what design meant and what they cared about in terms of their environment. At the time, they had put, or let's just say they owned a parcel of land in Gentilly, which is a neighborhood outside of New Orleans. I'm actually going to reference New Orleans a lot tonight. I know not everybody's been there. It is, but I think everyone understands the river likely as a landmark, and then the French Quarter, and then you can kind of see the shadows here. That's the CBD. So that's sort of the core of the city. This is way north of that, towards the lake, and it's in, basically what we think of as kind of post-war suburban development, at least in New Orleans. But it was a 5.5 acre parcel that was created. It was actually vacant except for a number of mature oak trees. But it was vacant as a consequence of, if you see that dark line just to the left of the site that's been highlighted, is the New London Canal, which was breached during Katrina, and actually right at this site is where the breach was, and it wiped whatever structures were on the site at the time away. So they had a vacant parcel, and this is where we began the work. Where we started was trying to basically lay this out for Bastion as a sort of starting point of what a housing community might look like on this site. The program was always sort of elusive in a way. He had a constituent, like 170 people he was trying to get on the site, that through these process groups that he'd gone through seemed like the right number of people. There are a lot of, when I say it's an intentional community, it's based on a community healthcare model where your neighbors sort of help you as much as you rely on, say, healthcare workers. And so the social structure and the social fabric of the housing is what's critical in how this thing operates. And so hence again the importance of architecture in this realm. But we had a blank site, and so we went about investigating different ways of breaking it down. And so these are just analysis of the original or the surrounding neighborhood and what lot sizes look like. This was an analysis of the site itself, where we were just overlaying what were the issues that we were trying to incorporate or address, let's say, as part of our own development plan. And so the ideas of accessibility, access from either bike or transit, communal open space was a big part of this, where people could gather. Collectively, the trees that I mentioned before, beautiful live oaks, what New Orleans is sort of known for. Scale, what we were saying earlier about the neighborhood, trying to mesh as best we could with this development into the neighborhood, but at the same time have what was requirement for the people living there, this sort of scales of privacy, which I'll get into in a minute. But at the same time, we needed density, right? So part of our work was like trying to figure out how to get a multifamily housing development in basically a suburban context, and what does that look like in our case. And then, again, looking back at the organizational priorities that we described before, this I'm showing you now sort of a finished composite of the house, or the way the housing blocked out ultimately. And I won't go through this in detail and kind of scan through some of this stuff, but this was the final, I should say this is sort of our working site plan right now. All the dark or all the black rectangles are built units at this point, and then that large open area, which you can't see the gray blocks on there, is the third phase, which we're actively working on right now, which, if completed per their schedule, will be done in 2022, possibly 2023. So this has been a 10-year, ultimately a 10-year project for us, working through this. This is the project as completed up through phase 2. You can see CBD in the background, and then the housing development, and you get a sense of the texture that we were working with there. And again, these are all just well, I'll get into the structure in a second, but this is, again, residential fabric that we're working in, and you start to see some of the layout and the configurations there. The trick was this is actually technically an affordable housing development, so it used affordable housing tax credits. The application of the QAP, as is referred to in this case, prioritized what they call scattered site developments. In other words, these needed to be autonomous buildings. But at the same time, as we were working on it, it was meant to, and the intention is that it was developed as a full community. So there's no distinction between a unit and a yard, but it was all sort of communal space. So the site development was a big component of this and how that relationship worked overall throughout, but then also within the units themselves. We basically had two different buildings that we just did different things with, as you'll see. Like there's a repetitive roof form, but in terms of the 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom configurations, it was always sort of a chess game. So even though they all look the same, there are no two buildings that are alike on site. And then that relationship that I described is really critical, and especially how the units and the entrances work. We configure these in such a way that you had 2 units on one side, 2 units on the other side. Essentially, you had a fourplex that all shared a entry courtyard. And so you're looking down one of these courtyards right now, and that was a critical piece of the social structure of the development. As I said before, he did a number of these working groups, and it was determined that like the right number of neighbors for this. For the people that were intended to live here was 4. That was sort of the magic number. It's like you needed more than 2, but no more than 4, neighbors around one another as a way to create a kind of localized or a small scale community. And this is just a sort of a diagram of how that configuration works, so that everybody comes to kind of a central pad and then they move into their unit off of that. And again, these are 2 distinct buildings. In fact, they're on their own separate lots of record even. And then you can see it from above in this case. But part of this and what we were working on was our desire, our sort of architectural desires, and what we were working through to try to resolve formally, typologically, and so forth. And what's really pronounced about this building, or about these buildings in this case, and what we worked quite a bit on, as you can see some of the study models here, was just working through the right silhouette for these structures. And part of that, it has to do with the way we were creating space and connecting the 2 units together, again, through this sort of fourplex communal connection, but also working with scale. These are all elevated. They're about 5 feet off of the ground, and so the working to kind of make these structures a bit more ambiguous, like you don't know how big they are or how small they are. So some of the manipulation in material, but also in windows and even the shape of the roof in this case, were all a part of that. And then you can see them in unison as they work together. So we just flipped, as you can see, we just sort of flip them back and forth in this case as and you can see a group of them all collected here. This is from the phase 3 parcel looking back. And then this is the silhouette itself that I was talking about. And so the big window is kind of important because, again, it's like there's no division or anything, and it's hard to sort of tell or determine what the actual scale of these things are. And so, again, working with that ambiguity. But the section also hid the kind of mechanism or the working of the project itself. There were a number of things that we were trying to navigate, the trees that I mentioned, and so the structure, the foundational structure was important in how we drove piles to eliminate any root or to minimize root damage, and so we were able to get these houses really close to the trees themselves. And then even working with something like a prefabricated truss, which we're enamored with just because of its flexibility and generally being inexpensive, let's say, in the world of framing. And how we could use that in unison with the kind of normalized 9-foot plate, but use the volume of the truss and the volume of this roof to give more sort of spatial complexity to the interior of the unit. So even though they're all the same on the outside as a form, inside you get this variation of room dimension where you get these little interior gables essentially. And so there's actually a lot of volume in these. There's also attic space and everything else that we were able to house inside of the truss itself. So as I mentioned, that's a project that we have been working on for quite a while now, and is rolling into another phase, which is a whole nother project actually. It's no longer housing, it's a wellness center, which is, hopefully I'll have a chance to present that at some point in the future. But one project that I've not presented actually, but it's something that we've worked on. It started at the beginning of the pandemic, and it will finish construction within the next month, basically. So it's one that, as much as I'm talking about longevity, this is one that we started and will finish essentially over, let's hope, the course of the virus. But CCPCS stands for the Clarksdale Collegiate Public Charter School. Is a mouthful. So see, you get used to calling something by its acronym and you forget what it stands for, but it's CCPCS. And it's in the city of Clarksdale, Mississippi, which again, another sort of classic southern city. It's about an hour south of Memphis. For those that might not know the Mississippi Delta, the home of the blues, this is the location of the Crossroads, the sort of famed origin, if you will, of Robert Johnson and other blues legends. It's a city that we've been working in for about 3 or 4 years now, and this is a component of, or tangentially connected to, a larger objective, which I'll get into at the end of the slideshow, in this city itself. But the project site was actually, again, it is a charter school. It's the only charter school in Clarksdale. It is a K-8 building that started off a couple of years ago in an old church, which as you zoom in, this is the site for the church itself. And so they approached us about basically doing an expansion of the existing building to make it. I think they were up to the 3rd or 4th grade. They'd gone to modules, and so our job was to grab onto to renovate the existing building, but at the same time do an addition that was about double the size of the existing structure. So our job was actually to come in, figure out, look at this existing building, try to kind of determine what the existing characteristics of this were, what the issues were, and then reformulate a new school structure around this building and embrace it at the same time. So this is just a series of diagrams I'm going to run through quickly that just looks at ways that we're looking at circulation and other aspects that we could grab onto as a way to create again, a new school campus in a way. And so these rings, so circulation became a kind of critical point in how you moved and navigated the entire school through the existing building. Adding on a new footprint in this case, so this is a new building adjacent to that, and how it tied into those components, or into those circulation components. The creating internally a set of courtyards that the school then looks into. So this new building kind of embracing the old building to create internal space, reorienting the entry to the main street instead of the side. And then, developing a series of walkways that, again, sort of reinforce the circulation that we mentioned, but also worked with, in unison, the courtyards that we were developing. And then there were certain large capacity program spaces that we had to distribute around the site as well. And so these old sanctuaries function as cafeterias and auditoriums, and then the new spaces as libraries and gym spaces. And then in the end, this was the final composite. And then this is a site plan, colorful site plan of the existing buildings, the purple structure, and then all the new stuff that we did on the outside. And so this is, and I'll say, and you'll see this more in the other work, is like these are the kind of things that we really get excited about, is trying to engage with our fabric, right? It's strangely enough, it's like a big green field is a challenge for us. Like that's not. We typically don't encounter that, and our work really does play off of and play into the fabric that we have around us, whether it's city or, in this case, an old church that we were here to tie into. And you saw in those preceding diagrams what we were trying to do. This is an axon of the new building, old building, and the two that come together. And so in this case, not unlike Bastion, we're working with a roof form as a way to sort of play peekaboo with this existing building. And so the silhouette comes into play again here. And so this is the front facade, so simple form. But what's hiding behind that is also a sort of complex spatial structure, again, created as a consequence of using these prefabricated trusses. So here's where, techniques, we repeat and kind of move through to different projects as a way to sort of our continued process of elaboration through different ideas. This is it under construction. This is a little more recently, forgive the construction photos, but just to give you a sense that it's real. I guess you wouldn't believe me otherwise, but there it is. And I like to scatter jokes in here to see if everybody's listening to me or not. And I should have also said that feel free to interrupt me as I'm going through this. It gives me a chance to drink water. Okay, so anyway, that's CCPCS, again, project that's underway right now. We have 2 more phases on this project that we're working through, and they're projected to go into, by the time it's all said and done, this will be another 10-year project for us, essentially, in this city for this school. A project that we're probably most known for these days is the starter home, and this is one that I usually use as the kind of basis of the entire talk. I'm trying to break up what we discuss publicly about our work these days, so it's not just about starter home, but I will say that there's no other project, and I'm using project with a capital P here, that's run through our office that's more emblematic of the way I can imagine we aspire to work as a practice, and in that it's holistic. It's high concept in a lot of ways, but it engages with topics that are meaningful to us, but as I said before, they're topical, they're meaningful to a lot of people, and it was also trying to tie into something that we felt like people weren't paying enough attention to in some ways. This project started, again, probably back in 2013, 2014. It is, as I like to say, kind of effectively done now. We've cycled through a number of projects on this one, and we don't really catalog our work under this mantra anymore, but it was about a 5 or 6 year project for us in that case, nonetheless. So anyway, it all started with, and this is where I'll kind of get the spin up. Is just, as a practitioner, you working with private clients, but also, observing what's going on around you in the world as an architect, you start to recognize things, and you start to at least contemplate possibilities in the environment that you're in, and you can imagine and believe that there are other ways to do things that people aren't actually doing at the moment. But that said, likely nobody here is familiar with this film, but it actually deals with the folly of architects getting involved in residential architecture in general, or speculative residential architecture in general. But I kind of use it as a trope in a way of like how we have a tendency to sort of muck things up that we feel like we're trying to fix. So cognizant of that, but at the same time observing that speculative development, and I'll be a little more specific about what I mean there later on, but speculative development and the real estate industry were driving homogenization of the housing market. So the sort of banality that we all moan about, again, as practitioners, is driven not by the architects per se, but more by the ones or the agencies that are producing it and influencing it. But also not to discount that development itself is risky business, and there is risk involved in development, and that homogeneity is actually a form of reducing risk. But that the housing market, let's say, is not that complicated either. It's developed through, there are 3 or 4 different pieces that you're moving around regardless of the scale. That said, it's quite complex nonetheless, and how those pieces work with one another. So there was a way that we felt like there was a way to manipulate that. But then also, again, as architects, speaking for a second, it's like an affinity for and a desire to engage in a lineage of, let's say, domestic architecture or residential architecture for the masses, if you will, as epitomized in the book by McAllister here. And again, having an affinity for that work, an appreciation for it, but also a desire to contribute to it in some way, and not in emulation, but like, how do you move it along as part of the conversation? But then also tying into something like Starter Home, which has a lineage and a legacy, and I say architecturally speaking, but also and the psyche of us as a public, and the notion of what a home you start in means and what that represents to someone in terms of generating wealth, but also as a young family or as a child growing up in a home, starter home as I did. Through this was, as I mentioned, it was several years in the making. Through that conversation and dialogue, which was happening internally in the office, where we were trying to sort of put our arms around this as a concept, and as a way both to describe it, but also as a way to engage with it and propose and project in some ways. But through that process, came up with an agenda. I'm not going to read this out, but this was in a nutshell, if you will, what we were trying to do or accomplish in the work that was we were working on in relation to that. But this. But it goes beyond New Orleans, like I said, and once again, it was at the time and still is very topical. But it was, what could you do to, or how could you make this applicable in other locations? So we started looking at, what was the thing that we needed to dig into. It wasn't necessarily the building, and it certainly wasn't the financing. What were the opportunities or the holes in the market that we were seeing? What were they exactly? And so this is where we gravitated towards looking at land uses and hidden opportunities with land. And so this is a series of analysis just looking at different cities where we were, inspecting what we saw as opportunities and different locations to put housing, essentially. All that led to our doing a deep dive in our own city. So this is New Orleans, and this is an analysis, hard to read, of course, but of vacancy in our city and the number of lots that were sort of available. And you'd have to see this up close to understand it, really, what we're looking at here. But this is sort of a gradation of what we saw as lot sizes, but also where they were vacant and where they weren't. So that was a mapping exercise for us. It was also looking at what were the other sort of criteria that mattered for us if we were to begin to select sites that were appropriate for this agenda. And it had to do with locations or proximity to the CBD. So you see this kind of left to right spectrum of the number of units is that bar chart, and then starting on the left, they're next to the CBD, and the further you get to the right, the farther they are from the center of the city. And then we were kind of cataloging the different zoning types that were associated with them. And then in that sort of combing and filtering, we recognized that there were within our matrix, and I won't go into too much detail about that, but what we decided were like the ones that we should care about. We determined that there were 5,000+ of these actually in the city, and what these are, and what I mean by that, were these non-conforming lots, which were sort of small parcels of land that people didn't understand as buildable parcels of land. And they were you could find them through mapping pretty easily, but they were actually kind of challenging to locate in the field, if you will, because they were often somebody's backyard, or they were covered in grass or weeds, and you just assumed they were just part of the neighborhood in a way, or there was a fence in front of it or some other reason, or they were buried, and you couldn't get to it regardless. But they were everywhere, as we discovered. And so what we ended up doing was going, okay, well, let's see if we can't locate more of these and try to locate clusters. So we worked through different neighborhoods, just trying to sort of parse out where we found enough of a concentration of these things that we might imagine not just one house but multiple houses on these parcels throughout a neighborhood, and that collectively they sort of spoke to one another and worked together as a unit. And there was a financial model we were working through that actually used one to leverage another. But nonetheless, like we ended up zooming into a neighborhood called the Irish Channel. In the channel there were roughly, let's say, 30 of these lots, 30 to 40, I forget the number now. Let's just say 30 of these lots that were available. We actually went and tried to buy all of them, at least piecemeal. We would reach out to owners and try to connect. A lot of these are owned by public entities or churches. Some are owned by individuals that you couldn't connect with, and then some were owned by developers, as it turns out, who are the most reasonable people, believe it or not, whenever you're looking to buy land. And so let's say the consequence of this endeavor ended up, we over the course of, between 2014 and let's say 2019, we were able to build 17 of these on 5 different sites. And I'm going to go through each of these individually to sort of talk about them and what each of these houses represent. Some of these were self-developed, some of these were developed with partners, some of these were private clients that commissioned us to work on the project. They all fit the agenda that I described earlier, like this is, or had on the screen earlier. It's like they all had a similar objective in mind, but they built off of one another, and each one we used as an opportunity to explore another dimension or another possibility with housing, and housing specifically in this realm. So 3106 St. Thomas was the first project that we worked on. It was the sort of quintessential non-conforming lot. It was the property that we were able to purchase, again, from a developer, was 16 feet wide by 55 feet deep. It was literally someone's backyard whenever we purchased it. In fact, the neighbor was, after they found out we bought it, they weren't too happy about it, in fact, and they mobilized the neighborhood against us to build something on here. But through that process, anyways, we purchased the land and we were able to, build our first house on this particular site. With generally everything that we work on in this series was all as of right. So you could build on these lots. There were no variances. We didn't make special requests or anything in order to create these homes. It just had to, as an architect, you had to determine how to make these things work. And so with a 16.5 foot wide lot, you basically get a footprint of 10.5 feet with your side yard setbacks, and with 55 feet deep, in this case, we were able to build back 45 feet. So it was a 10 by 45 foot home. And that was the floor plan, and this is it constructed. And you can kind of see the context that we're working in here. These are a lot of the neighborhoods that we're trying to work in are actually transitional areas. This is part of a historic, or it is a historic neighborhood. If you were to look across the street, and actually the house that's next to us is probably an 18-something year, probably 1880s, 1890s home that's next to us on the left. The warehouse, of course, is from the 50s or 60s, and that'll come into play later on. It was when I say transitional, it's as we were working on this home, there was another home, there was a vacant lot, another one that we tried to purchase, but someone else was able to buy it, that was being built by a speculative single-family housing developer, our nemesis, if you will, the people we were working against. They were constructing that house, and it sold for, it's a 2,000, maybe 1,800 square foot house, and it was between $600,000 and $700,000. Lots in these neighborhoods are going for between $200,000 and $300,000. And so, to get into the nuts and bolts of this, part of what we were trying to do was, how do you create housing that people can afford? And that's using the aid word here, and being self-selected to some extent who people are, but nonetheless, let's just say middle income could afford in a neighborhood like this. Part of it was gaming things like land values. So when you're paying $200,000 to $300,000 for a lot, the house isn't going to be $200,000 or $300,000. It has to be $600,000. It has to be $700,000 in order to to make the numbers work for the development itself. And this was, so we were able to sort of get in here early, purchase the land before the land values went kind of crazy. We could have, by the time we bought it and got ready to start construction, we could have sold it for twice what we paid for the lot. That's just how fast things were changing all around us. Again, I'll continue to sort of talk about that as we move through this, but for a house that thin to work on a site like this, it's all about sections. So again, you're starting to see some of the what you were seeing with Bastion, and even with CCPCS, the using roof form in this case as a way to both hide program rooms in this, for basically a 2-bedroom, 1.5-bath house. But also to work with scale and work within the context of our neighborhood. As it turns out, it wasn't intentional, but the profile of this house is not dissimilar to the profile of the house next to us. So it's sort of, people saw it as a riff off of that. A lot of this work, too, I'll say, is in a full historic district, so we have to go through a historic commission. They have to approve everything that's done on the house, down to the light fixtures and everything else. It's a pretty strenuous review process that these are these houses are constructed in. Most of them are anyways. This was the inside of the house before it was purchased. This was, when I say speculative, we didn't have a client. I have a business partner that I do these projects with that's not part of the architectural firm, but he and I built this house together. My office obviously we were the architects for it. It went on the market for sale, and it sat there for almost a year, you should know. So whenever you think about, risk and development, it's like we thought there'd be a huge market for projects like this. Well, it turns out we may have been wrong about that. But someone ended up buying it. In fact, they were a lovely couple that moved into it and it's recently sold. But as that project was moving along, a funny thing was happening in the city that they were actually trying to sell off a lot of the property that they had under their possession. The city of New Orleans was trying to sell off or auction off a lot of the property that they had. And as I mentioned before, a lot of these small lots that we found were city owned. And so this auction happened. It got a lot of publicity, and at the same time, some local news agencies had seen the house that we were working on, and so there was this sort of confluence of us getting recognition for a little house and a lot of people buying little lots and not knowing what to do with them. So through that process, the next two projects you're going to see are sort of a consequence of that. And the first one, 2215 Felicity, was for, in this case, a private client came to us. More specifically, he was homeless. He had just moved here from Philadelphia. To New Orleans from Philadelphia. He had about $25,000 in a bank account. He was a service member. He used that money, he used about $5,000 of it to buy the lot, and he had roughly $20,000 left over in order to build a home. And so he came to us by way of what I just described. He learned about us through this process and said, hey, you're the guys. In fact, the city told him to come talk to us, like, you guys are the ones to help me with this. But with the other house, part of the press that I was talking about, they would often call it a tiny home. It's not a tiny home. It's almost 1,000 square feet. We then endured the rage of the tiny home movement because we were trying to call it a tiny home, but we weren't, whatever. And so that was actually kind of interesting. But when Mike Burnside came to us, with Michael Burnside, who is the client for this house, he literally wanted a tiny home. And so this is his house and his lot on Felicity Street, and it's 184 square feet. It is, I think, still the smallest permitted residence in the city of New Orleans, and it had to be permitted. In fact, they had to write clarification in the zoning ordinance that qualifies, or had to clarify what a cooking appliance was. We were trying to get away with a microwave and therefore make it a dwelling unit, but it had to be more permanent than that. But anyway, so it's 184 square feet. We worked in collaboration with Burnside. This was a pro bono project for us, and these are his sketchbooks, which was basically our payment for the project was that he allows us to hang on to these. They're extraordinary. This documents years of him thinking through and investigating what a home would be for him, and it's amazing. Like I think one of these pictures are when he first met, like the first day he met us, which was really kind of cool. So there's a business card taped into these little scrapbooks, and it's, little leaves from the site and everything else. It's phenomenal. I mean, these just as documents are really extraordinary. And again, we're sort of the holders of it in this case. But we worked collaboratively with him in order to generate a plan and a house that he could build on his own. And so, as I said, it's 184 square feet. We formed it in a way that he would have to cut as little as possible on site. He had never built anything before, so this is all new to him. He had no power on site for a long time, so anything that he did, I mean, this is in the city, but of course he didn't have temporary meter. He lived on the site for a while. He had actually ingeniously sort of stacked some lumber for the construction project, but had made a hole inside the lumber that was kind of tent-like for him, and so he would actually live on site quite a bit while he was constructing it. And he, as he built it, embellished it as well. I mean, we imagine it as the most pragmatic thing you could imagine. Like, here's just a box, and we're going to put windows in it. I think the lumber order was, everything. He took our plans to Lowe's. Lowe's did the takeoff, including the mechanical equipment, the windows, everything, and it was, I think, $12,000 or something. Like, we have the receipt for that, which is quite interesting. It's also, as I often equip one of the uglier houses in New Orleans too, and sort of proudly so in some ways. The color of the house is actually from this organization called the Green Project, where you can get white paint or you can get this color basically, and what they do is just sort of dump all the colors together, and that's what you end up with. So it wasn't like he didn't go in and say I want tan or whatever this color is. It's just like I'll take color over white in this case. And anyway, so a really phenomenal project and an extraordinary person. And this relationship with Michael has actually gone on for years now. I haven't seen him as much as I'd like over the pandemic, but he's an extraordinary advocate, like amazing and incredibly intelligent. He was a physics teacher for years and just chooses not to work, essentially. And he is now in this home. He has no mortgage. He's able to, live basically off of his government service check. He's sort of at retirement age or pension age now, and so he gets a stipend based off of his service. And he is, for all intents and purposes, he's more of a citizen than anyone I know, in the truest sense of the word, right? He's engaged in politics. He's engaged in his neighborhood. And he can sound like a crazy old person sometimes, but he's an extraordinary advocate for things like housing in particular. And so anyways, it was an amazing experience working with him through this process. So anyway, that created that. Those plans we're working now to try to create a set that we could hand out if somebody wanted to build the house and they have access to it. They've used it as sort of a tiny house typology around the city as well. And so that's another little piece of advocacy that kind of spins off from this. Another project, I'm going to have to speed up a little bit here, 4514 South Saratoga. This is kind of interesting for us because in this case, we had a private client come to us and basically say, we purchased this land, but we're going to basically give it to you and pay you to develop what you do, the starter home project. So this was instead of, and this is kind of nuanced, but the architects in the room will appreciate this, practitioners in this room will appreciate it. It's like clients come to you and tell you what they want, essentially, like, I want this. This is the kind of, I would like a house with 3 bedrooms, or I want an office building with, 100,000 square feet, whatever it is. This was actually having someone come to us and say, we want you to tell us what we need here, and we want to support your agenda, was kind of flipping the script in a significant way for us. But the net result was this house, which again was on a small lot. And you can see a little different neighborhood, but this was the fabric of where they were. Is called a portion of the city called Uptown, neighborhood called Uptown, and it was. I think I have a plan in here. Yeah. Well, before we get into the plan for a second, it was basically a square lot, but this was our attempt. Instead of just building a home that was for a couple, we were trying to build a home that was available for a family. So a 3-bedroom, 2.5 bath, roughly 1,500 square foot house on a lot that was 30 by 35, which is 1/3 the size of the lot to the right and the lot to the left, but probably equally sized home. And again, what you have to do to make that work is all sectional, so you can see how we sort of stack program here up into the roof plane. So from the exterior, you can see the sequence of going around. The second from the right is the street side, where we dip the roof all the way down to the second level. But as you move around to the rear yard, we pick it up on the third level, so you have views out from the back. This manipulation of material was, as I mentioned earlier with Bastian, our working through your sort of understanding and ambiguities around scale and how big was the house, how many floors was it, and so forth. And then these are shots of the interior and just looking around. And then this is it again in context, and you can see the sort of low shotgun houses that sort of trail off in the distance there. It's essentially its context. But what we've enjoyed about these houses is that they sort of participate both at the level of the street, but also at the level of the block or the neighborhood. And so how you especially with this kind of volume, and how you see this house sort of poking up in amongst the traditional homes that are all the way around it, and sort of mimicking, if you will, these open gable ends on the other houses. another project in this vein and a larger development where we actually worked through multiple units on a single lot. So this is a little different than the previous projects where we had one lot of record and we put one house on it. This was multiple units. It's St. Thomas and 9th Street. The parcel was 12,800 square feet. That's important when we're doing unit counts. If we were to subdivide it and sort of follow the model that we were working on, then we would have made 3 lots over this. But based on zoning, we were able to develop 12 units on site. But because of the subdivision regulations, we weren't able to subdivide or make the parcels that we were after for 12 units. They would have been non-conforming. You can't create non-conforming lots. But it's also one of the things that we were trying to accomplish with this as an agenda, which was a form of advocacy. So in the way that we were, which I can get into in a second, about working in historic districts, contemporary work in historic districts, we were also looking at ways that we could show or demonstrate different ways to think about land use and density in conventional areas. Thank you. I'm out of water already. Thanks. Oh, is there? Well, should I stop here before I get into this one? Yeah, go for it. Yep.
So I know you said you wanted some questions to give yourself a water break. So I've got a
We're gonna be here all night. Yep. Yeah. How does he? Yeah.
It's funny because I'm sure like the environment for getting through like city and community review is very, very different there than here. But I'm curious like what as you're looking at this project
Yep.
and the previous project,
Yep.
what are some of the strategies that you employ to work the city through what your thought process was on a certain development or a certain
Excellent question, and actually, I can thank you for saying that. And I disagree. We don't get through things quickly, and I know you're just chiding me about that. But so back to that original house. I'll try to make this brief. But as the story goes, we went in, we bought this lot. My partner specifically is a guy Chuck Rutledge, who's an amazing person. I'll talk about him in a minute. Was like, there's no way we can put a house on this lot unless we go get a variance. We can't have these setbacks. We need to build to the property line. It's like you can't make a habitable home on a 16-foot wide lot. And we're like, okay, that's fine. Let's go do it. So we show up to what is basically a public meeting for a variance request, and the whole neighborhood had sort of come together and we're there and just kicked our ass. Basically, they're like, "There's no way you're not going to get this. Sorry." It's and the zoning board they may have given it to us, but they deferred because of everyone's problems. It turns out the neighbor got everybody together, the one that was mad that we bought the lot from. So that was sort of the story. But lesson learned. We're like, you know what? Everything else we do is going to be as of right. And part of that, it became sort of a disposition. It's like, we don't need you to change your rules in order for us to do what we do. And so some of getting through this is that we understand what you need to do and to meet the rules, and so we don't have to ask for as much leniency or whatever. So that's part of it. And so there's a kind of ethos of like, let's work within the rules. And this project is actually emblematic of that in a lot of ways. So I'm glad you stopped me here, and I can talk a little bit about that, or at least frame it in a little different way as we move through. The historic piece is different. And again, I don't want y'all to think that we don't want to work with community. That's not true. It's just like we just didn't want to have to ask for anything. It's we're just trying to put a house here. In terms of the historic district, that's kind of that's another piece, and I could probably talk all night about that. I'm going to try to move a little bit quicker, but that was something that we also wanted to work hard in trying to address. And so the idea that we worked, so when I said there are 5,000 lots in the city, those 5,000 were all in historic districts. So this was another sort of hurdle we were trying to to cross with working, trying to create what we thought were contemporary and emblematic, contextual and emblematic contemporary work in a historic district. So we didn't see anyone trying to produce that. It was, not that it doesn't exist, it's just especially speculatively, and especially in a lot of these neighborhoods, it was either you were going to emulate a historic home, or it was going to be a neo-mod, box essentially that you try to sort of cram through the historic district, and you could, but it wasn't always easy. And so what we were trying to do was sort of be more respectful of the context, in which we want to be more respectful of the context, and use that as a way to sort of play into the formal material and the sort of overall kind of logic of the housing itself. And as we worked a couple of these through the it's called the HDLC, the Historic District Landmarks Commission. When we were working in them through the commission, it's like all of a sudden they sort of started speaking our language with us, and we could work them through, and they understood what we were up to. That doesn't mean a lot of these go through once and twice and three times. They don't go as quickly as it seems that they do, but at least we had a dialogue going with this entity, and at the end of it, the former director, actually this project in particular, was like, this is as he says, and sorry, I don't mean to pat myself on the back, but he was complimentary, like this is one of the strongest, if not the strongest project he'd ever seen in a historic district. It won the one I'm getting ready to show, won a historic preservation award, even though it's a new building. It won a historic preservation award. Didn't get mentioned tonight, but that's the one I'm actually quite proud of. We could be known for that one if you wanted us to be. So but anyway, that's part of the genesis of all this and where it came from. And again, I usually treat just starter as an entire talk, and I'm trying to run through it kind of quick, but that would have been part of the discussion as well. Subdivision regulations is another entity in the city that we were all bent out of shape about what they said. They don't do small lots. It's outdated. It says August 1999, but it's actually the 70s. This was just a rewrite. It's terrible stuff. They're working on it now, and in fact, we're working with our client who's a council person to rewrite sections of this. But part of that advocacy via our work has enabled us to now participate in the creation of policy, right? So that was the whole point. Anyway, so in this case, I showed you this graphic already. It's like looking at land and how do we get density on the site. In our case, if we weren't able to make the lot, then we were going to find another way to do it. And this is when we entered the realm of the condo regime. And so we started using legal terms as a way to describe land and property. And so the way we got our 12 units was actually going through this legal construct to create 12 lots via the condo regulation. And I'll get into what that means exactly in a second. This is just some formal arrangements where we started, what our envelope was, what our context was, so you can kind of see these, the warehouse context that we were in, and then how we created this undulating roof form and then divided it up into our 12 units. This is the site plan. They are all, with the exception of what you see as 8 and 9 there, they're all standalone, so detached dwellings. There are, most of them are 3-bedroom, 2-bath. There are a couple that are smaller, but they range in size from 930 square feet up to like 1,450 square feet, something like that. So small by national standards, but work on this site. And again, working sectionally. So this was what you just saw was a ground plane. As you moved up through the second and third floors, you see the buildings get denser and thicker. I can explain some of the program in a second, but it's pretty basic. The ground floor was always the living, dining, kitchen, and then as you moved up through the building is when you got bedrooms and baths. This silhouette, something that we play with quite a lot, that you see along the perimeter, the kind of black on your left side there is that 1880s Creole cottage that I mentioned. The little rectangle in the gray behind it is actually the first home that I showed, so you start to see its silhouette. The blue is all the new, and then how it ties into an existing warehouse to the right. And then, of course, these sort of solid and voids that we were working with on the ground plane. This is a model of the project as we work with a lot of three-dimensional models, and we iterate routinely, hundreds of these things that we just go through to try to find the right setup. And then this is the building as constructed. So This one finished in about around 2017. We took about a year or so to sell these. Whenever they were 2018 was, I think, when the last sale was, and now we're actually starting to see some turnover, so people are moving out. This, if you can kind of notice the little roof popping up there of the first house that I showed you, 3106, and then this was adjacent to it. So what we ended up doing was actually buying the warehouse that you saw in that first building and the vacant land next to it. Coincidentally, the person we bought the land from was one of the people that came out originally and complained about the development. In fact, he was the one that was in some ways most vocal, and his comment, public comment in that case, which I love, was like, they don't need to build a house on this little lot. What if one day I want to build a house on my site and then this house will be there? It's like, which makes no sense, but that's what they, but it turns out he ended up selling to us after 6 months or so of bickering with him. He sold the parcel to us. So we redid the warehouse. There are 2 units in this. This is the street front that you're seeing. Each of the homes have, with the exception of some of the units in the rear, each of the homes have their own front door, their own front porch. You can see they're vertical units, again, 3 stories mostly. And this is sort of turning the corner, and you can see the last one to the right there kind of dipping down to the edge of the existing warehouse. So we were very much sort of picking up the motif of these little low gables and then playing with it as it moved around the corner and then reconnecting. The interior space that it created is we have an affinity for these sort of negative spaces. That's what that blue diagram was earlier. It's just like working with and thinking through the spaces between buildings for us, which is, quite frankly, one of the more phenomenal things I find in New Orleans, is just how buildings relate and the spaces that they make. We were doing the same thing. This shot to the right is actually the parking lot, but it serves as our courtyard. And then you also see sort of you also see an embrace of this existing fabric and trying to pull these warehouse buildings into our site. And so landscaping against and then building around. And then you can, one of the units you can see again, this sort of front porch, and then the entry area, and then this proximity, and then how, you live next to one another is very New Orleans. Also, it's like people are right next to you, even though even at that, there's sort of a sense of privacy, but inclusiveness as well. And then, here's the context around us, so you can kind of see inside one of the homes and then looking out. With the bananas on the counter there too. And I have to say, this is actually my unit. I will admit that. A funny story is we started working on this and we got underway. It's under construction, and we just had our first child. Well, it was 2 years. Well, no, we actually just had our second child. And so my wife and I were in an 1830s shotgun that was a few blocks away from this. We were contemplating renovations and additions in order to sort of accommodate our larger family and how we're going to grow into the house that we were in. And eventually, so we're walking around the site one day. I said, "The hell with that! Like, we were just going to buy one of these things and move on about it." So we ended up purchasing a home. But what was nice about it is, like, it wasn't conceived as our house, right? So we actually designed these and around a speculative person. And it was fascinating to become that speculative person ultimately, right? And so you realize the work that you do, you're often doing for yourself, whether you know you're doing it or not. And this literally turned out that way. And it also kept my wife and I from arguing with one another. Okay, the last one in this sequence is 3609113 South Saratoga. This is the last ones we finished in around, let's say, 2018. 2 lots in a different neighborhood. They were right next to one another. I bought these with Chuck, the person I mentioned before. Chuck sold them to me. He said, "I don't want to mess with this." I said, "Sure, why not? We'll do it." We had already invested in the design of a couple of houses there, and so I didn't want to turn back. This was, architecturally speaking, this project had a lot to do with, what infill housing looks like in our city, and what, to what degree do we have, architecturally speaking, to create, the impression of a building or the sort of spatial experience of a building when you're just seeing the front of these things. And so navigating this, composite of the porch and the entry door and the other components that make up, the front of the home. And so what we started looking at were, again, defining it through geometries, and you can see these radiuses that we worked with as a way to kind of soften, but pick up on some of the arches that we saw in other parts of the, on parts of the street. And then kind of pulling that apart and creating layers so you had that overall composition, and then to break it up and kind of fracture it and sort of peel the laminated, if you will, across, you know, what ended up being about 20 feet of the front of the house in this case, because we also wanted to incorporate parking in this. So that was another big thing. A lot of these houses don't have to have parking. We wanted to figure out a way to incorporate the garage, if you will, as a piece of the home itself. We also had two of them, so how these two compositions worked with one another to kind of one built onto the other, kind of jumped over to the other side. So they're literally sisters in a way, so they're joined together, kind of mirrored from one another, although they're not identical. And so these layers kind of, they do different things on either side. So a bit like Bastion, they look the same, but they're all different. These look the same, but they're both quite different. Model, this is the built house. There's a vacant lot next to it, so you get some kind of room around it. This was completed. Again, these are both spec houses. They both sold. The garage and that space of the garage that we're showing there, which we conceived of more as a porch in this case, and even put a ceiling fan in it, so it felt more like a place that one would gather in this case. And then that's the entry, so you can kind of see this compounded archway that brings you all the way up to the front door, kind of pulling you in. But as I mentioned early on, it's like each of these projects for us were ways of exploring components of the housing system. So it wasn't just, you know, I'm talking about the architecture more tonight, but and even the planning, but it was the other pieces of how housing gets made in our country. And one of those is the notion of the investor and the person who is there and responsible for the funding around the creation of housing, and how that's often, you know, you don't know who that person is, or it's the wealthy person that manages to put the money in, and they're the benefit, let's say, of the return on the house. About, as we were getting through this, I won't get into it, but there was U.S. policy that was going into place that allowed or permitted equity crowdfunding. So it's actually crowdfunding from anybody, so non-accredited investors. Somebody asked me questions to clarify this. But any person could actually put money into a thing, in our case real estate development, but it could be a business, it could be anything, and then they could actually see a return from that. They would take the risk, but they would the potential to see a return. So it's taking the crowdfunding model, which I think everyone is familiar with, where you might get a t-shirt. In this case, you would get, 8 or 10% return on your investment, or at least as we projected. This program is a consequence of the recession. It was part of the Jobs Act that was put in place as a way to sort of get us out of it, and we were, in this case, leveraging it. We were the first equity crowdfunding real estate project in the country, so we tried this we were the first ones to do it, essentially through a platform called Small Change. This was the listing. We asked for $95,000 as our equity investment. 39 people contributed somewhere between $500 and $10,000, depending on who it was. That allowed us to get that $95,000. We used that as the down payment, if you will, for the construction loan, and we were able to build the house. We lived with 39 different people over the course of about 3 or 4 years as we developed these projects and were able to sell them. But then at the end, we sold the lot, and they all made money off of it. The last series of work that I'm gonna go through is I begin to lose my voice here, is called Travelers, or I'll refer to it as Travelers. It is our next, if Starter Home has kind of wound down, I would say this is our next project that is the kind of big P project for us. And it started out, again, with our partner, this guy, Chuck Rutledge, who had an idea about creating a hotel that would actually support artists and support artists and allow them to be artists or to do their work. And what that effectively meant was establishing a kind of economic model around a hotel as a revenue generator that enabled someone to work for, say, 20 hours a week and have room and board taken care of, have a stipend, and be able to live and spend the rest of their time working on art, presumably, and then not having to worry about paying rent and not having to worry about working another job to make a salary. And so that was the idea. And this is sort of a diagram, take me a minute to unwind, that talks about how that works essentially. But it's a model that, again, we started working on about 3 or 4 years ago in concept, and are still trying to sort out exactly what it means. But the first one that we were able to get done and was actually in Clarksdale, Mississippi. So again, back to Clarksdale. This one involved, the project itself involved an existing hotel that had been abandoned that we were able to purchase, converted it to a 20-room hotel. We also purchased a small community store that had housing on top. And so in tandem, these two buildings, the hotel and the community store, function as a way to support the residents of the program in this case. There's a cooperative element of this sort of shared resources, but that one. What are you trying to say? I'm going to have to take a bathroom break. Yeah. We redeveloped the hotel and the community store, and then this is a series of diagrams about how those two actually spin off and benefit the local community. So the hotel is there for the tourists, the community store is there for the community itself. And so also the idea that just through these activities they become catalytic and create other opportunities within the city itself, whether it's surrounded or whether it's about art, whether it's about housing, or other development opportunities. This is a little diagram of the store and the hotel next to one another. This is the existing building that we worked on. This is it when we got it, so it was all sort of gutted. Beautiful, it was a hotel historically, and so a lot of the, as it turns out, a lot of the hotel fabric, at least on the second floor, was still there, so we were able to build from it. Plans of the development, so we had to rework it. This is a historic tax credit project. So it had to meet all the Secretary Interior requirements for that. The plan on the left is the existing rooms. The plan on the right, there were no walls on the ground floor, so we had to kind of redevelop that. This was the design objective, was to sort of allow the existing to be the existing, and we layered on these new pieces, which were basically the vanities, the things that made it a livable room. This is it constructed and finished, so you can see the lab and the bathroom, and then the beds that went along with it. And again, this is our big project for us that we're working through and trying to work through the nuances of in the different realms that this kind of impacts. But as an architectural project, it was quite interesting because it was it's our first project where we went from like beginning to end on something in a real way, in that we worked on we did all the historic tax credit work internally, which is not that big of a deal, but something to do. Of course, we're the architects. We did all the FF&E, which again is not that crazy, but we were buying the glasses, we were buying the sheets on the beds, we set up the website for the hosting site for the hotel, so when you go book a room in one of these hotels, we actually put all that together. And then down to the graphics and the koozies and everything else. And so this was one of these sort of holistic projects that we touched everything from start to finish on the job, which was, again, quite interesting. That moved on to our second one that we worked on. This is just completed. This is the first time I'm really talking about it. This is one in New Orleans. It is a new building, actually, that's on a lot on Magazine Street, so a prominent commercial corridor just outside of downtown in New Orleans. This one's a bit smaller. The other one was 20 rooms. This is a 9-room. Essentially, we're calling it a B&B in this case, which is what zoning refers to it as. But this is it constructed, and you can see the context that it's in here. The makeup in this case is a little more condensed, so where we spread out over a couple of buildings before, this one is all of the functions of the building and the program, let's say, are housed on site. Entrance lobby on the ground floor, 9 hotel rooms on the second floor, and then the top floor is where the artists actually live, the ones that are the operators for the program. And then that office space in the back, in this case, is our office, so we ended up moving into this. And again, this is it constructed and architecturally, again, working in a historic district, and where we were sort of playing off of, you can see on the other side of it, the Creole townhouse, which is a classic typology in the city, especially along the street front. And so this bifurcation of the front and the back was important. So materially, you have the brick on the one side, which was the street presence, and then the rear quarters were always of a lesser, cheaper material, in this case, siding. And then and then working through the kind of layering of the skin, you can start to see familiar signs here from us on this project as well. We stepped the building out in this case and created these sort of deep, what are historically referred to as hood arches over all the windows. So what would have otherwise been a fairly flat building, just through the manipulation of the floor plates, we were able to sort of create these coves and depths in the building that you wouldn't see in a contemporary project these days unless it was intentional and articulated. That's it as completed. And again, our office there on the ground floor, and then the building and the units in the middle, and then the housing on the top. You see it in scale with the adjacent building. The entrance is actually off of the side court, so you sort of move in through this courtyard area and then into the lobby space of the hotel. And this sort of vertical, ultimately it will be a planted out space. And then that you can then see through, as I had shown in some previous photos, this sort of context is kind of brought into the building itself. Okay, so with that, I want to say thank you for letting me walk through our projects tonight, and I enjoyed it. I hope you did too.
I think we're going to stick around for some questions, and with that, I'll open it up. We have a first out there.
Is the new building across from Mojo?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's amazing.
Thank you.
No one else knows what I'm talking about. We haven't been there in a year now.
Well, speaking of like moving, and this is actually another one of these projects that process is really kind of fascinating. We had worked on this site for years as a multifamily development. We had to get a variance for a rear yard setback on the building. We had gotten it, but there was a 2-year time frame where we had to start construction. We were getting close to that 2-year point. We knew we were going to have to go back out to the neighborhood and ask for this variance again. One of the neighbors said, "No, I'm not going to do it." And that was enough for us to basically abandon the multifamily project and go, wait a minute, this is the site where we should put our artist, co-op project. Like, let's just do that here. And so it was in some ways like an epiphany because of some procedural thing. We're like, we're sort of forced to do it. It was fantastic. The person that was the neighbor that did it is this guy, Sam Richards, who was the shop director at the School of Architecture and was a friend of mine who was standing up saying, "I don't want this guy doing this work here," which was kind of painful, but we really appreciate it in the end. He was instrumental in working with us on the form and trying to get the scale down and everything else. As we started construction, unfortunately, he passed away. And his partner reached out to us immediately and said, "Sam would want you to have his house, and would you all be willing to rent from us, and could you use it," because he really believed in the program and what you all were doing. And so we now have it under long-term lease. 2 of the artist residents live there now. It has a full wood shop. It has in it. We're going to host community programs out of that space as well. And so his partners and Sam's children are involved in that process as well. So which is really phenomenal. Was amazing. It's really sad that Sam passed away. It's tragic. But to know and to learn how much he cared about the project and wanted support, it was also, it was really extraordinary. So anyway, that's another component. And when I say that these projects are generative, that's also what I mean too. Is we're trying to spread out, we're trying to grab onto things. The one in Clarksdale, if I'll get my act together, is a whole talk in and of itself of the sort of constellation of activities that have started as a consequence of just that one development, right? And so we're hoping or imagining that the same thing will happen at New Orleans. So. No, it's a good question actually, and I do get asked that quite a bit, and I skirt around and I'm not really clear about, I talk about ambiguity a lot. Like I love ambiguity, clearly, right? Clearly I love ambiguity. Sorry, no. Well, and it's in this preamble that I came up with for this talk was me reflecting on a desire to behave in a certain way, that what I used to refer to as being promiscuous. It's like you can go out and you can philander and do whatever you want. And to have the sort of freedom to develop a relationship with someone to work on something and then move over to something else. And say, hey, we're gonna spend the next 6 months working on a research project that we're just going to deal with in-house. It's like that's to me what practice was, right? Like this is an opportunity to have, control over and the freedom to do sort of whatever you want. And as I said at the beginning, it's like the consequences of that have been really fascinating. They're not all great, but they've been really fascinating. And so so in the case of we are, and I tell people this all the time, we are a traditional architectural office. That's who we are. We operate like a practice. I'm the principal. There are people that work there. So you could define the office pretty simply and just say we're conventional practice. That said, in projects like the starter home, even these hotels, it's like we work with other people as originators of these concepts, and then as co-developers in these projects, and then we, as co-developer, me personally, I often have ownership stake in it, and ownership stake is interesting. I'll parlay our services as part of the ownership stake. I don't, have a big bank account. I'm a poor old architect like all of us. But that's what's kind of nice too. It's like I can use, as I said before, the sort of agency of the practice to work with others and in ways that I might not otherwise be able to do individually, right? So I have those resources that kind of make that work, and that means that we're parlaying traditional work in order to support those activities as well. So, I could single out individual projects, but like let's just say St. Thomas and Ninth, there were 3 principal partners, myself, this guy Chuck Rutledge, and another person, Pierre Stoos, who's a general contractor. And so Chuck often behaves like the developer owner. I behave like the architect, and then if Pierre's involved, he behaves like the contractor, as it were. So as a team, we're all owners, but we find our own roles, and then we all have an ownership stake in the actual project as it is. The the New Orleans Traveler is the same way. Those 3 people all work together on that project. There are projects that I just do with Chuck. There are projects that we just do on our own, and then we have a whole slew of clients. I again, also appreciate the question, because we often get lumped into this kind of category of architect developer, which I adamantly say we're not. We're not set up that way. We don't structure ourselves that way. We'd be an embarrassment to most developers anyway, so I'm just going to stay out of that. And we don't develop necessarily as a means of generating profit either. That's not a business model. It's an exploratory tool for us, right? So, yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Does that limit, were you able to serve the whole AMI market with that, or was there sort of a lower limit to that?
Yeah.
You talked about low land prices.
Yep.
As a way of profit.
Yep.
Are there subsidized methods that build you as a practice?
There are, and actually that's a great question. Thank you for asking it. And it's and I ran through the starter stuff. It would, if I did a more lengthy sort of setup for that one, I would have talked a little bit more about the rules that we put in place for ourselves. The reason, so subsidies, at least for our model and the way we work, so back to who our partners are, we're individuals. We're not sort of set up to deal with going after LIHTC and everything else. We don't check the boxes more often than not for traditional subsidies in that sense, and even at that, it's a challenge for us to go after, let's say, city-based subsidies that might be CDBG stuff, whatever that they're home funds or whatever. we don't even qualify for that fundamentally because we're not even a development entity, so we don't even have a business as we sort of come together as just an LLC. We don't even have like a name for what we do. I'm the only one actually with the name of an office out of that group, let's say. So we steer clear of the subsidy piece just to try not to complicate things, but also to say, okay, what can you do if you're not in the realm of subsidy? Is like, okay, we're trying to work in the most simplistic terms possible. It's like we go to a bank and ask for a conventional loan. So which means that we had to be more inventive about the other levers that we pushed and pulled, and land values were one, and so the metric there is like, little parcels cheaper because it's less square footage, but it's also they're cheaper because nobody thought they were worth anything. That's all changed now. They're just as expensive as a regular lot these days because they're just scarce. But that was one of the levers that we were push and pull. And as an architect, we could, as the design component of that, we were capable of conceiving a livable house on something that others couldn't. And so therefore we had sort of an advantage as a team that we felt, at least early on, that we could, again, leverage that as capacity as a way to sort of drive price down. But also it made land available to us that others weren't interested in too. So the sort of market scramble to try to find buildable property, this was a whole different realm nobody was really messing with. In terms of driving the pricing down, this is also kind of the metrics of real estate development in general, looking at comps, right? And so when we talk about location, we're looking for areas and neighborhoods where the comps are high enough to support new construction costs. And so by comps, those are comparable pricing for those that don't know, comparable pricing on housing in the neighborhood. And so that sets a square foot cost. So if you're looking around a neighborhood and the comps are, you could buy a home for $130 a square foot, let's say, in the neighborhood. If it costs $175 a square foot to build it, clearly you shouldn't be building housing there because a bank's not gonna loan, that value. So we just knew that, and so we're also, when we're doing this mapping, it's like we're looking at real estate values and trying to find like these soft spots where it wasn't crazy, but it also wasn't so low that it wouldn't support new construction. We didn't want to do renovation either, so we sort of said we're here to build new housing. And then, so once you have the comp value, we always sold at comp. We didn't sell under comp, even though we could. And the reason why we didn't is because you would have flippers that would come in. And so if we sold under value, then somebody would come in, buy it, and then a month later they'll turn around and sell it for the actual comparable value. And so they basically got immediate equity out of it. So we're also sort of surfing this price range or comp range to make sure that we were just at it, not above it, not too far below it, so that we didn't have speculative flippers that were chasing projects, which they will do too. So they kind of scurry around and try to find undervalued parcels and buy it. Okay, in terms of being able to hit AMI, so to your question, did we ever hit it? No. Did we get close? Yes. Part of like this smaller land, less embedded costs. So when I could buy a lot for $25,000 instead of $200,000, and then build a house that was half the size of a comparable home with the same number of bedrooms and everything else, then we were looking at. We stopped worrying about a comp and we started worrying about what the total cost of a home was. And so we may have sold for $270 a square foot, but our house was under $300,000 or $200-something thousand, where the house next to us was $600,000 or $700,000 because it was bigger, it was on a more expensive piece of land, and so forth. So that's how we tried to get to it. We would always run numbers that bracketed 80% AMI, and in theory we could have hit it sometimes, but it's like construction cost goes kooky, and like it was always kind of a challenge there. The last houses that you saw, those would have sold for what would have been an 80% AMI. That's probably the lowest we ever could have gotten. except that neighborhood, by the time we finished the housing, had gone bonkers, and like the comps went way crazy, and it's like, okay, we have to set it at a certain level, and also had investors, so they were all happy when it was all said and done at that point too. So for it to actually work, what I'd say is that we could probably get to it at some point, but it would be finding that sort of sweet spot. And also, like, through repetition, like, we needed to build more of these, we needed to build more at the same time. Like, there's nothing economical about what we were doing. Even though they weren't expensive homes, the 2 houses we built last, which we had total control over as owner and architect, so I didn't have anybody else telling us what to do, were the cheapest houses we built. They were $116 a square foot, and everything else we had done was, anywhere like $140 to $155, which is really low in our market for construction costs regardless, but it's still, we were able to just sort of drive it down, and that was another sort of chip on our shoulder, is like, as a profession always being blamed for sort of running the cost of something up. It's like, no, screw you, we're going to show you that we actually know how to control cost and we can drive values down. We have developers now saying that they don't want the project to be that cheap, we want to spend more money on it and things like that. Not that we want it to be that cheap either, but that's the consequences there. So yeah. Yep. Yeah, it absolutely was. Yeah, it's so the other, as I said kind of early on, it's like we had a tendency to sort of embrace the sort of ordinary and the overlooked and everything else. Part of that project and a desire to sort of drive construction costs down out of necessity, but just also, again, like chip on the shoulder thing that I said earlier, is like we had a contractor that we work with price the project, and it, of course, is more than we wanted to spend, and he does a lot of let's just say suburban development, right? And so, but he also works in the city on these little projects with us. And as he was pricing it, one day I was like, look, tell me what you would do in a suburb in order to make this house, be affordable, right? Or like that, would fit within market constraints and everything else. He goes, well, first thing I'd do is get rid of that Hardy and put vinyl on it. I was like, okay, we're getting rid of the Hardy and we're putting vinyl on it. Let's go. And and I know that's nasty and everything else. It's like there's a lot of bad things about vinyl. There's a lot of good things about vinyl too. Number one, like you can power wash it. You never have to repaint it. You never have to do anything. If you sort of think of the virtue in that respect, and I'm not up here trying to convince people to use vinyl, it's just in this case it was appropriate and it made sense. And it had some of the characteristics that we cared about. That's why we were using metal, for instance. It's like you don't have to repaint it. You just power wash it, and hopefully it, and the environmental conditions in our city just wear houses down. So we were, as a first-time homeowner, it's like maintenance costs. We were trying to think, sort of long-term about how somebody lives in one of these places. So anything we could do to kind of chip away from what the liability and responsibility was for a homeowner was important. And so vinyl kind of checked that box for us. So we said, let's do it. Furthermore, it works really good for arches too. You can bend the stuff. It worked out great in that case. So currently so true low-income housing, which in our case would be via subsidies, so LIHTC, typically low-income housing tax credits. It depends on when you ask us that question. Bastion, which is underway right now, is a project for us, but I'd say we have currently if it's not 50%, it's maybe 40% of our total workload right now. That's that. And in, I don't know, next month it could be more like 80 if we lose all of our other projects, and those are the only ones that hang on. But they actually, as it turns out, I'm not to be flippant about this, is that they constitute the major work in our office right now. Or at least the major office or major work that's coming up, and they're all New Orleans-based projects. They're in the 40 to 50 unit range, so they're not huge developments, and they're all inner neighborhood, vacant parcels, let's say, and they.
Here, they don't have mixed income.
Yeah.
Sometimes, I'm fortunate because
Yeah.
We have $1 million like mansion right on the corner of Chavis Way.
Yeah.
You know,
Uh-huh.
and you have like 20 meters away like a slum.
Yep.
Pretty unbalanced.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
We have beautiful architecture, but most of our stuff was destroyed in the Civil War. But
Yeah.
we do have something great.
yeah.
And the epicenter is where it's kind of chopped up. Where historic book is, which is beautiful.
Let me clarify real quick too. When I say low-income housing, every one of those projects are mixed-income developments, right? So they have market rate development. So Bastion has, I'd say, a quarter of those houses are all market rate, and then 3/4, or maybe the other way around, I forget now, the mix, are all subsidized and at different tiers, 30 to 60 to 80% AMI, right? And so in the projects I just described that we're starting on right now are also all mixed income. So there's a portion of those units that are for market rate, and then others that are subsidized units. So and so that there's no, I mean, we've never worked on a 100% affordable development. So when I say affordable, it's always a kind of mix of a blend of those things. Well, I mean, in fact, last night, a community conversation about a development that we're vying for. We haven't gotten yet, but we're trying to, with the development team right now, to be selected for. The conversation that sort of comes up more now for us as a city is the role of home ownership along with affordable rental development, right? And the sort of blending of those two, and trying to figure out that, trying to ensure or incorporate that into developments is the kind of the trick that people are trying to figure out right now. And this one was or is an attempt to incorporate both ownership and rental, affordable and market rate all in one development. So. Need another cup of water up here.
Yeah, sorry. You have a lot left, actually, so I think you're in good shape. I think it's all the coffee you had this afternoon. Dehydrates you.
Maybe something.
I've had this every night. Hate to cut it off, but really appreciate the work you're doing. I've said this a couple different ways over the several nights we've been here. One of the main reasons we planned this was partly out of passion, but also partly out of conviction. I've always been amazed by the work that your firm does. And your commitment to making sure that it's always, or the majority of it is directed towards the social good of the city we live in.
Thank you.
That's really, really inspiring. We planned this lecture series to kind of hit on some really important topics that we think the city's facing. These are not topics that we necessarily address well as a firm, just to be as honest as possible about it. But it's what we wanted this series to be. And so I'm so glad you guys came to hear it tonight. We do, super risky, have another event on a Friday night, which means either tons of people are going to come and party, or no one's going to be here at all. We'll see how that goes. And we're also learning that not everybody has the stamina to keep this up night after night after night like our office does, but that's a special thing about our office. I did want to just give a shameless plug for what's coming tomorrow night. I know a lot of folks who aren't in the workshop have departed already for dinner and other good causes, but we do have Sekou Cook coming tomorrow night. He's the incoming director of urban design at UNC Charlotte, and he wrote he has a monograph that is titled Hip Hop Architecture, and I'll just read a quote about it so you can see how heavy-hitting it is. He's also an incredible speaker, as you were, and it should sound a little bit like church or something is what I've heard, but here's the book, Examining the Present and the Future of Hip Hop Architecture. The book also, oh sorry, I'm reading the wrong paragraph, that was awkward. I'm gonna start again. That was my phone's fault, it scrolled down. As architecture grapples with its own racist legacy, hip-hop architecture outlines a powerful new manifesto, the voice of the underrepresented, marginalized, and voiceless within the discipline, exploring the production of spaces, buildings, and urban environments that embody the creative energies in hip-hop. It is a newly expanding design philosophy which sees architecture as a distinct part of hip-hop's cultural expression and which uses hip-hop as a lens through which to provoke new architectural ideas. It's going to be an amazing talk. I hope you guys can all make it. Just as important, I hope you'll be able to spread the word to your friends and get them here to hear it. It's something that our city, like all southern cities, like all cities in the U.S., struggles with, just a complete lack of equity in the built environment in terms of who's making the buildings, who has access to the services of architects, and who becomes architects in the first place. So I hope it's something you can make the time to come out for. Thank you so much for the talk. I do have one other small announcement. On your way out, there's some new flyers on the table. The city of Raleigh has this really great program they do every year called the Sir Walter Raleigh Awards. These are local awards that recognize projects that have made a significant impact on the community in a variety of ways or lots of different categories. If you work for a firm or have been involved with a project that you think has had a significant impact on the city, I hope you'll take the time to look into that program and submit. They just opened submissions today, and it's an important program to know about. Thanks so much for coming. Thanks so much for the great talk. Robbie, thanks for the great introduction. Thanks for coming.